You have a password on your phone, a code on your front door, a folder somewhere labeled private that only you can open. Keeping something secret today is almost automatic. You type a few characters, and an entire wall goes up between your information and everyone else. But for most of human history, there was no lock like that. No writing, no encryption, no way to store a secret outside of a human mind. So how did people keep anything hidden at all? The answer is far more clever than you'd expect. Start with the obvious problem. Without writing, every piece of knowledge had to live inside someone's head and had to be passed from one head to another by speaking it out loud. That sounds like a terrible way to keep a secret. Speech disappears the moment it's spoken. Anyone standing nearby can hear it. And every time information passes from one person to the next, it risks changing, shrinking, or twisting into something else entirely. This isn't just a guess. In the 1930s, British psychologist Frederic Bartlett ran a series of experiments now considered classics in cognitive psychology. He had people read an unfamiliar story, then retell it from memory to someone else, who retold it to someone else, and so on, in a chain. By the end of the chain, the story had changed dramatically. Details vanished. Strange elements got smoothed into familiar ones. People unconsciously reshaped the story to fit what already made sense to them. Bartlett called this process reconstructive memory, and it revealed something uncomfortable. Human memory isn't a recording device. It's an editor, constantly rewriting the past to fit the present. Think about what that means for a secret. If a piece of information changes every single time it passes from one mind to another, then secrecy isn't really the hard part. Survival is the hard part. A secret that mutates into something unrecognizable within 3 or 4 retellings isn't a secret anymore. It's noise. And yet history is full of examples of knowledge surviving intact across dozens, sometimes hundreds of generations, passed by voice alone, with no writing to check it against. So if memory is this unreliable, how did entire cultures manage to preserve enormous amounts of knowledge, word for word, generation after generation, sometimes for thousands of years, all without a single written page? The answer starts with structure. Unstructured information falls apart in memory almost immediately, exactly the way Bartlett's story did. But structured information behaves completely differently. Give a piece of information rhythm, rhyme, repetition, or melody, and it becomes dramatically more stable. This is why you can still recall song lyrics from your childhood without trying, while you'd struggle to repeat a paragraph of plain instructions you read once yesterday. Ancient oral cultures understood this instinctively, long before anyone had a word for cognitive psychology. Homeric epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, poems tens of thousands of lines long, were passed down for generations before they were ever written. In the early 20th century, classicist Milman Parry, later joined by his student Albert Lord, set out to understand how this was even possible. Parry traveled to the Balkans, where oral epic poets were still actively performing, and studied how they composed enormously long poems on the spot without ever reading from a script. What he found was that these poets weren't memorizing the poems word for word at all. They were using a toolkit of fixed phrases, rhythmic patterns, and formulaic building blocks, snapped together like modular pieces, allowing them to reconstruct a poem of massive length in performance every single time, with the core story staying intact even as the exact wording shifted slightly. This is one half of how oral societies protected information. Structure made knowledge durable, but durability alone doesn't explain secrecy. A poem performed for the whole village isn't a secret at all. So how did societies protect the knowledge they specifically wanted to restrict? Consider how strange this makes the whole idea of oral culture. You might imagine a world without writing as a world constantly on the verge of losing everything it knows. But structured performance turned the opposite into true. A well-built oral tradition could be more stable across centuries than a single handwritten manuscript, which could be lost in a fire, eaten by insects, or simply misplaced. A tradition held by dozens of trained performers, corrected against each other during communal recitation, had built-in redundancy no single physical document could match. This is where things get genuinely clever, because ancient secrecy rarely worked the way you'd expect. It usually wasn't about hiding words. It was about restricting who was allowed to receive the performance in the first place. Across many cultures, from West African Griot lineages to Indigenous Australian communities to secret religious orders in the ancient Mediterranean, specific categories of knowledge were reserved for people who had gone through initiation. An initiation could take years. It could involve trials, tests of endurance, oaths, and ritual instruction that only made sense to someone who had already been let into the earlier stages. Even if an outsider somehow overheard a chant or a phrase from a restricted ceremony, it would likely mean almost nothing to them. The words themselves weren't the secret. The meaning attached to those words, taught only through years of structured initiation, was the actual secret. You could steal the sound without ever stealing the knowledge. Think of it like overhearing half a conversation in a language you don't speak, except worse, because even fluent speakers of the language would be locked out if they hadn't earned the right context. A chant might reference a location no outsider could identify, an event no outsider had been told about, or a symbolic meaning layered on top of an ordinary word, a meaning taught only at a specific stage of initiation. Strip away that context, and the words become a shell with nothing recognizable inside it. This gets even more striking when you look at how some cultures encoded extraordinarily practical information into what looked, on the surface, like religious storytelling. Science writer and researcher Lynne Kelly has spent years studying how oral cultures encoded vast amounts of factual knowledge using memory techniques. In her research, later published as The Memory Code, Kelly examined Indigenous Australian songlines, long chains of story, song, and landscape that stretch across enormous distances. On the surface, these songlines sound like myths about ancestral beings traveling across the land. But embedded within them is something startlingly practical. Navigation routes, the locations of waterholes, seasonal patterns of plants and animals, and survival information critical to crossing some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Kelly argued that this wasn't a coincidence. Ancient cultures around the world used the same underlying trick your brain already responds to, tying abstract information to vivid imagery, physical locations, and sequential journeys, a method closely related to what's now called the method of Loki or memory palace technique, a device the ancient Greeks credited to the poet Simonides of Ceos, who according to legend developed it after a banquet hall collapsed, and he was able to identify the crushed victims purely by recalling where each guest had been sitting. So the same tool used to remember where the party guests sat was, in other cultures, scaled up into a survival technology capable of encoding thousands of years of ecological knowledge disguised as story. Put these two ideas together, structured memory and restricted access, and you get something remarkably close to modern encryption built entirely out of human cognition. The information wasn't locked behind a password. It was locked behind years of ritual initiation that only certain people were permitted to complete. It wasn't stored on a server. It was stored across dozens, sometimes hundreds, of trained human minds, each one a backup copy, each one a checkpoint against loss. If one person forgot a piece, others could correct it during communal recitation, the same way modern systems check data against multiple copies to catch errors. There's something almost uncomfortable about how much effort this required and how invisible that effort has become to you now. You unlock your phone in a fraction of a second and never think about it again. But a griot in West Africa might spend decades training to hold the full oral history of a kingdom in memory, ready to recite on command, with penalties for distortion severe enough to be treated as a form of social betrayal. A young initiate in an Indigenous Australian community might spend years earning the right to learn a songline that encodes water sources across a stretch of desert larger than some countries. These weren't backup systems. They were the only system. And maybe that's the real reframe here. You tend to think of secrecy as something you build outward, a wall, a lock, and encrypted files sitting quietly on a hard drive somewhere. But for nearly all of human history, secrecy was something built inward, into trained minds, sustained through rhythm, ritual, and relationships, refreshed constantly through performance, and protected less by hiding information than by making sure almost nobody had the tools to understand it, even if they heard it. There's a strange kind of resilience in that model, one that modern digital security still hasn't fully matched. A password can be guessed, cracked, or stolen in an instant. And once it's broken, everything behind it is exposed all at once. A secret held in trained human memory, distributed across many people, verified through communal performance, and locked behind years of earned initiation, doesn't fail that way. There's no single point of collapse. Even losing one keeper of the knowledge doesn't destroy it, as long as others remain to correct the record and carry it forward. You still carry pieces of this system whether you realize it or not. The rhymes you use to remember a phone number, the song you hum to recall the order of the planets, the inside joke your friend group shares that means nothing to anyone outside it, the exact same principle a secret society used 3,000 years ago, just with much lower stakes. You have a password on your phone. Somewhere behind that password, though, is the same ancient trick your ancestors relied on for tens of thousands of years before writing ever existed. Information is safest not when it's hidden, but when only the right minds know what to do with it. The lock changed. The idea underneath it never did. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.